Hello there, this video is going to be talking about Seamus Heaney's poem Digging. It's largely for use for IB English A students doing their individual oral commentary, but also could be used for anyone else interested in the poem. So I'm going to go through the poem section by section. I've colour-coded it so you can see where there's a change or a development, so it helps me to break the poem up. So whether you're doing an oral commentary or writing an essay about this poem, that technique is quite useful. It allows you to show development and progression through the poem. So to begin with, then, as a summary of what happens in this poem, this is Heaney describing various generations of his family, his father and his grandfather, who were very much at one with the land and very talented in terms of working the land and digging. Heaney describes them with some affection, but also then reflects on himself and how he fails to follow in his father's footsteps and his grandfather's footsteps, and then struggles and decides and discusses how he can define himself, how he fits into this picture, if he fits into it. So the title Digging is quite important because it connotes the physical digging that the fathers and grandfathers do, but also for Heaney it connotes digging for truth. As a writer and as a poet, we see that he does his own form of digging mentally as opposed to physically. Okay, so let's start going through the poem section by section. The first two lines are quite straightforward. Between my finger and thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun. Seems to define Heaney the poet. He's physically holding something, a squat, a short pen like a fountain pen. Snug as a gun, perhaps that phrase we normally would suggest snug as a bug, something that's very comfortable, something that fits very easily. To Heaney, holding the pen is a very natural act. The gun, for other people it may be natural to hold a gun. They're designed to be held obviously by the hand. Possibly it has connotations of the Troubles in Ireland in the mid-60s. And for Heaney, equating the gun to a pen is important. It perhaps reminds us that the phrase that the pen is mightier than the sword, and for him he's able to achieve a lot with this one pen. And then we move on as a line end here. We move on to the next section, and where it positions Heaney. We see where he is. He's sitting upstairs somewhere, and under his window he hears the sound. He doesn't describe the father, but just the action, which is important. Under his window he hears a rasping sound, as a nice phrase, a clean rasping sound, that actually we see what happens here. It's a nice onomatopoeic phrase, and we see the spade sink into gravelly ground. It's heavy alliteration there, sums up what's happening, get a real sense of the digging taking place. And then my father digging, very simple phrase, seems to define the father very much like the first stanza defines Heaney. I look down in this enjambment. So is that a subtle sense that he's looking down metaphorically upon his father in a patronizing type of way? Possibly not. There seems to be a lot of affection for what he does, although he's taken a very different path in life. So this enjambment occurs, and then we see his straining rump. So clearly straining is making an effort now. He's an older man. Clearly the father must be older, and he's struggling to dig. Here he's among the flower beds, which suggests he's at home, or he's in a garden. Digging is not digging, it's digging for pleasure here, not for food or for anything else, as we'll see later. So it suggests that he's in retirement. Bends low and then comes up 20 years away is an interesting phrase, or 20 years ago. But he is in Heaney's memory here, it is 20 years away from here. In this section, he's no longer straining, but stooping in rhythm. It's much more adroit and natural physical act, much more skillful when he was younger, where he was digging. Again, that phrase, that verb occurs again. And in the next section, we see the description in a lot of detail, which suggests it's a very vivid memory for Heaney and one that he enjoys going over. The coarse boot, of course, it's rough, it's been used a lot. And then on the lug of the top part of where you put your foot to lever the spade. So lots of jargon here to describe the actual spade. Expertly done. Much like Heaney holds the pen, the father holds the spade, and it's a natural thing. They work well together. Rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep. Lovely phrase that describes the the physical act of going through the digging here. To scatter new potatoes that we picked. So is this Heaney out with his father helping him to pick them? It seems to be, and he seems to appreciate what's happening here. Loving their cool hardness is a sort of synesthesia. Their cool hardness in our hand. If you've ever picked up new potatoes, you can get a real sense of that. And so in this section we see how skillful the father is and how much Heaney admires his father for this. Interesting phrase here, by God, tends to stand out. It's not poetic, it just sums up how the old man can handle a spade, much like Heaney can handle a pen. And then interestingly, rather than continue the sentence, we have a full stop here and a short, simple phrase, just like his old man, which suggests Heaney's grandfather was very similar, had this sort of skill. So we move on to the grandfather in this section, but it's also worth pointing out that there's a hint here that perhaps Heaney feels that he's missed out and he hasn't followed in their footsteps. You almost see in brackets, it almost seems to suggest he's saying, but not me. And then the next section describes the grandfather and a situation that he had with the young Heaney. It seems by any measure these people were very good at digging. The grandfather cutting more turf than anyone else on Toner's Bog. Toner's Bog suggests that whoever's he's talking to here, the speaker, has a knowledge of this area. It's just a bog is a sort of muddy field, if you like, good for digging. And then there's some sort of anecdote that Heaney remembers here. The bringing his grandfather milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper, is worth looking at. Corked sloppily contrasts sharply with the skill and the adroitness of the father and grandfather before him. Sloppily with paper, paper obviously plays a large part in Heaney's life, and perhaps here's an early reference to it. And he seems to be very inferior. The grandfather takes the drink, then gets back to work, no fuss. The verbs nick, slice, neat, very they're stressed verbs, trochaic rhythm here, and very clean, very precise type of verbs that reflect the very precise nature of the digging that's going on. Going down and down for the good turf. Digging. It's tempting to read that, going down and down for the good stuff. Digging. And again, that line, that word at the end of the line, summing up what's going on. Perhaps here there's a suggestion that Heaney is also going down for the good stuff, digging for the good truth, and trying to uncover what is here, what's actually happening. And then this final section sums up the more sensory imagery of the digging that takes place. The cold smells, again, more synesthesia of potato mould. And there's onomatopoeic phrases, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, onomatopoeic and nice sibilants there. So again, an appreciation of what's happening. The curt cuts of an edge, and hard plosive sounds here, the curt cuts of an edge are useful to describe. But then, going through living roots. I mean, they are going through living roots. If you're digging, clearly they're going through the roots of the potatoes or the earth or the plants. But living roots here perhaps suggests family roots and family ties, which is obviously relevant. Awaken in my head. So he has this memory of the cutting and the digging that's taking place here very vividly, because it means a lot to him. And these connections are important to him, even though he hasn't followed and maintained that connection with the land. And in this final section, he goes back to the beginning, the cyclical nature of the poem, where he returns to holding the pen in his fingers naturally. And is there a sense of regretting what's happened? Maybe not, because he seems to finish by suggesting that in his own way he will dig, and he will look to find truth wherever it is. And so that's his tool. Whereas the other people in the family have agricultural tools. For physical work, he has a pen for mental work, and in that sense, the whole family is continuing to dig in some way. In terms of the form and structure, it's written in free verse, so there's some rhymes, but no real overall rhyming scheme. We assume it's Heaney talking, but it may not be. it's there's a couple of little bits under here as well as an example. The first few lines, under my window a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground, is written in dactylic tetrameter. So we seem to have a certain rhythm going, but then immediately we're thrown by the phrase, my father digging. So there are half rhymes, there's a sort of rhythm almost happening in places, so it keeps our attention, it keeps our focus. And in addition, there's, as with most Heaney poems, an awful lot of assonance, consonance, alliteration to describe the physical nature. So it has a sort of musical quality, and that rhythm that's almost there is perhaps a little bit like the physical act of digging. It's not perfect, because obviously one dig is not exactly the same as another, but the rhythm suggests there's some sort of movement of nature in the rhythm there. Okay, I hope that's useful, and I hope you continue to enjoy Heaney's other poetry. Thank you.